few more people coming in. Cool. Okay, we'll get started as latecomers wander in. I've lost Nadim's face, which is the one person I need.
I'll turn up.
Yeah, so good of you. Great. So welcome everyone to the third of our series of Christmas chats. For anyone who hasn't joined us so far, Nick, I know there's one. This idea started with Fran and my efforts to make a Christmas party. We realized that we can't all get drunk together, and a Christmas party on Zoom would be heartbreakingly lame for a community of thousands. So instead, what we decided to do was to try and make us all feel a little bit more inspired, to think about what we could do to just make us feel a bit better going into next year and a bit more energetic. So I decided to ask the 5 people who have been most inspiring to me in my career to spend an hour just before lunch having a gossip, and invited anyone to come along. So I'm going to introduce Nadim in a second, but before I do, guys, please ask questions in the chat. Be as chatty as you want. Fran can reply to stuff as we go. I will be like feeding in the questions as we go. Of course, if anyone wants to like heckle, come off mute and go for it. That's also allowed. But get involved. I know this is a bit of an odd, uninteractive session. It's kind of set up and it doesn't need to be. So Nadim needs quite an introduction actually, because he's done so much. So I will read through the prestigious paragraph.
Oh no.
I know, I'm so sorry. It's like, this is your life.
Too much hype.
This is hilarious. I feel like one of your team wrote this. Nadim is an entrepreneur through and through. You can like take a little bow at that point. Before setting up ProQuo AI, he was the founder and head of Sadek Winberg Research, the largest global qualitative research firm sold to WPP. He served as global CEO for Millward Brown's Qualitative Network, then worldwide commercial and strategy director of Research International. He also does awesome things like brand manager singer and runs a motorcycle review channel on YouTube, as though he's not got enough else going on. Which maybe we can find some time to talk about. His main focus is as founder and CEO of ProQuo AI, who are one of the Copy Club partners, and actually a business that's kind of very, very close to our hearts, and the team are very firm friends. I think maybe to start with, Nadim, it would make sense for you to tell us what ProQuo AI does. And then from there, we can jump into your formidable views on small brand marketing.
Lottie, you're going to have to stop hyping it up. I can't.
Pressure! So much pressure!
Thank you for the introduction, and hello everybody. It's lovely to see you. Thank you for joining the session and considering that there might be something useful to listen to or interesting to listen to. As Lottie said, please interrupt and chat as much as you can and want. To answer the question, ProQuo AI is we're pioneering a category, so it's not something that has existed previously. And what we do, in the simplest terms, is AI brand management. And we achieve that really by doing 2 different things. We have an analysis machine and an action machine. And the analysis machine essentially has a particular bit of IP, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, based in neuroscience, and which understands what people need from a category, how competitors satisfy those needs, and where your brand fits in that triangle. So that's what the analysis machine does really neatly. And then the AI comes into play and it says, well, here are all the marketing levers that there are, whether it's distribution or promotion or communication or packaging or proposition, whatever they are. I mean, we all know them. And it looks at the intersection between the analysis that we've done of the category and the brands and what our client brand needs to do to perform in an optimal fashion. So the simplest thing that it does at the end of the day is spit out a few things that it says you should do, of course, said respectfully and with deference to your own judgment on things. But that is the purpose of it, to have a sort of software machine, a piece of AI that considers all the things that your brand is currently in the midst of and all the things you want to achieve, and it tries to roadmap for you the things that you should do to get there.
Fantastic.
That was longer than I wanted.
Really light by jumping straight into the neuroscience. Tell us Tell us about the science behind this, because it really is science.
Yeah, there's a couple of pieces to it. I think it's probably interesting and simplest just to go to the inspiration for it, which I was telling Fran about before we started. There's a guy called George Homans in the 1950s and 60s, a Californian, I think, who propounded the theory of social exchange. And essentially what it says is that we stay in relationships so long as what we get out of them is equal to or greater than what we put into them. And we leave those relationships when what we get out of them is less than what we put into them. I think he used it initially to just describe the difference between marriage and divorce. So if over a sustained period of time you get less out of something than you're putting into it, you tend to leave it. We've adapted that essentially, and we look at the relationship between people and brands, but in a similar fashion. And I suppose that kind of brings us on to another kind of founding thought of ProQuo AI, which is that we live in a time of what we call competitive convergence. It's not a term of ours. We've borrowed it from what's widely discussed, really. But what it means is that in most categories, we find that there are offerings which at a functional level are at parity. An easy example is if we all wanted to fly from London to New York, we would probably get on a Boeing 777. We'd probably be served 2 meals and a bit of drink. There'd be a few people walking up and down the corridor. It cost much the same, and the schedules would be similar. So at a functional level, there's not much difference, but you would probably be pretty certain who you'd prefer to fly with between American Airlines, British Airways, and Virgin. So somehow, even when there's functional parity, we look for a deeper relationship. So we knew that the brands which were succeeding the most weren't necessarily succeeding because of what they offered in their products or services, but because of the relationship that they managed to build beyond those offers. So that kind of brings us, tying the two things together. How can we know that the successful brands in the world are the ones with the best relationships. How do we measure relationships? Well, we base it on the notion of quid pro quo, the exchange between the person and the other party. And so we then developed what have become known as our 16 relationship drivers. There's no particular magic to the number 16. It just is that's what it stabilized at. We had over 90 at one stage, and we did all sorts of tests, and I won't take you into all of the analyses involved, but there are things like factor analysis to see whether we're just finding different ways of saying your brand's really nice. But it boiled down to 16 drivers of relationships. Some of those are arranged into what are more widely grouped as seduction drivers. They're the things which tend to draw you to a brand, its proposition, what people find appealing. I sometimes think of it as the promise of a brand. And then the other 8 go into what we call the persuasion set. And they're the ones which sort of sustain a relationship and keep you happy. So it's more like promise and then proof. It's a bit like pull and push. I also liken it sometimes if you interview people for a job and you interview them 2 or 3 times and other people interview them, you come away with this fantastic feeling. You feel quite seduced by them and what they might bring to the organization. And then they turn up late for work, and then they spill their coffee on you, and they have terrible BO, and their work is rubbish. And after 3 months, the persuasion isn't working. So you can have brands which are really seductive and not terribly persuasive. You can have brands which are persuasive and not terribly seductive. An example of that latter one is Ryanair, for example. Very few people love Ryanair, but boy, do they value the service that it gives them. So there's a sustained relationship. So there's no ideal blend of what seduction and persuasion should be in a brand, and we can come to talk about that a bit more. But they're the sort of they're the key pillars of it. So the notion of, do you have a positive exchange? How do you measure that relationship? 16 drivers to measure it. The final thing I'll say before taking a pause and not answering questions at great length like this again is that it's all very well having great measures, but you also have to have great measurement. So we talk about better measures measured better. And there we brought in another component of neuroscience, really, which is that we know, and people attribute different percentages to this, but we know that in the vast majority, the decisions that all of us make are based on our intuition, what people increasingly are calling system one, our reflexive, our gut instinct, our fast thinking. We rely on it to do everything like breathing, walking down a road without falling over, all these sorts of things, but we also rely on it, perhaps less obviously, to make most of our decisions about our relationships. And you'll all have experienced going into a room and with that first handshake, knowing whether you want to stay there for longer than a minute or clearing, preferring to clear off. We have these very strong pieces of sentience, and that's what the system one thing is. So the best way to measure that is with electroencephalographs, but they're pretty unpleasant, having a load of plugs on your head. And if somebody shows you a can of Coke and says you prefer this red or that red, and you got this thing on your head, you think, this is preoccupying me. I'm not talking to you about your stupid cans of red. So we had to find a kind of more commercially scalable and less individually invasive way of accessing that system one measurement system. And it turns out that actually a thing called implicit response timing is the best way to do it, which is really how swiftly you respond to something. So our 16 drivers are then served up to people who respond to them digitally, and we time the way that they respond, and that gives us a strength of feeling. So it'll be a positive or a negative sentiment to the driver, and it'll be slowly or quickly responded to, which shows hesitation about that feeling or kind of real passion about that feeling. And so that whole amalgam of things is a bit of the science behind ProQuo.
And if you put electrodes on someone's head and showed them a can of Coke in 2 different colors, what would happen?
Well, Hillary Clinton did it in her failed election attempt in 2016. She used great halls of about 100 people where they were all hooked up to EEGs. And what it shows you is a whole pile of activity, and it shows you the frequency with which people respond, and the speed with which it does pretty much the same as IRT, but with kind of more complexity and more nuance. To be honest, it's not a complexity and nuance that we particularly need. We've put the complexity and the nuance into the drivers, so that we look at things like, is your brand aspirational? Is it attractive? Does it offer good value for money? Is it seen to behave consistently? Does it show empathy with my needs? Does it behave in a way that I can relate to and feel comfortable being allied to? So we've kind of taken just the neuroscientific response mechanism and made it much more focused on what drives relationships with brands.
That is quite mind-blowing. I don't know if everyone else on the call is like, yeah, of course, that's the thing. For me, that is new news. So we've talked a lot this week about how marketing is different depending on where you're at in your brand life stage. If we think about smaller, early stage brands who are just building traction, what, in the scientific lens of the ProQuo AI tool, what does work for those businesses? Where should they be focusing?
A question that we're often asked is, of your 16 drivers, which is the most important one? And the answer is always, it depends on the category. What one needs to do always is to look at a category first and say, what's going on there anyway? And then look at whether that identifies a gap for you, or whether, you kind of want to go, it depends on your strategy. Do you want to be just another player in the category because there's sufficient volume and you'll have a sustainable business? You're trying to disrupt it by opening up a new space that nobody else has kind of seen. Having said that, when you're talking about young brands or newish brands, and a lot of the Copy Club membership is there rather than kind of big enterprise, long established brands, seduction is more important than persuasion. I think it'd be very hard to be a successful new brand based only on persuasion. So persuasion could be getting a fantastic distribution deal and getting your pricing right. That would be strong, components of persuasion. But if you don't have a sense of perhaps innovation or aspiration or empathy or something which kind of separates you from the crowd to begin with and draws people to you and makes them wish to explore your offer, you're unlikely to be able to push it. I always feel like you can't push something unless people want it. You can push it so far, but there comes a point when you don't really succeed beyond that. And perhaps as an illustration of that, I remember about 5 years ago working with Unilever. I mean, we also work with enterprise clients, though we're much more focused on challenger ones. And they asked us to look at the ice cream category in North America. We did a huge project and looked at ultimately 10 different brands. So does Magnum and Ben & Jerry's and all the usual suspects. Included in that set was a brand called Talenti, which wasn't very old at the time. I can't remember quite where it started, perhaps in Florida. It was an Italian family that had started with a particular gelati, process that was a bit differentiated at the product level. But it really was the way that they were packaged and the way that they had an experience of buying their ice cream and enjoying it that separated them. And when we did our analysis, we found that Talenti was the brand with the second strongest seduction, just behind Ben & Jerry's. And it had the second worst, it was 9th out of 10, in its persuasion. Some of you might guess what happened next, which was that big bad old Unilever just went and bought Talenti, because they can do the push, they can do the persuasion really easily. We'll get the value proposition right, we'll get the distribution right, we'll make sure that everything's consistent across all of their social media and their other places, blah, blah, blah. The machine can do it. But the origination of the idea, the seductive thought, came from outside the Unilever ecosphere.
What made it so seductive? What about the Talenti brand was scoring so highly?
It was partly the product, which was a differentiated product, and that's much as we play with all the levers of marketing and how they can do special things for a brand. Fundamentally, you've got to have a good product or service to begin with. So it had that. Its packaging had taken a different route. The story of the family that was inventing it was differentiated, a little bit like Ben & Jerry's, and their kind of political bravery had separated Ben & Jerry's from the volume players earlier on in its life. It just had a host of features which made people think that it was innovative, it was empathetic with their needs. It had a clarity of purpose. And it was, the story really needs to focus on, at least the one that I'm telling you, not so much about the components of the Talenti brand, but that young brands do best to focus first on seduction and get all of those things right, really focus on what you're doing in this marketplace. You can do it very openly and say, I'm in it to make something really different and something that matters. Or you can say, I'm in it to make a bit of money and I'm happy to piggyback on something else. If you're the piggybacking type, then you're probably going to have to get your persuasion more right, get your distribution, your pricing points, your consistency of presence and those sorts of things right. But if you're one that wants to change the world a bit, then seduction's the way to go first.
So if you are listening to this and you think, I want to be the challenging type and I want to be seductive, and also like when you frame it like that, who in their right mind is going to say, no, I'll just be persuasive? So much sexier to be seductive. What do you do? What's your kind of actionable advice to someone who's aiming for that?
Who wants to change the world?
And that seems particularly lofty, but who wants to build a seductive brand? Maybe we'll just take it down a notch.
I think building a brand and building a business takes a lot of effort. I mean, it's a truism, and sorry if that sounds in any way patronizing, but a kind of an aphorism that I live a little bit by is that it costs a lot to make a lot. And I think the first thing you have to do is decide how passionate you are about pursuing whatever it is that you're originating and founding, because it will take a lot of work one way or the other. I think, once you've kind of girded your loins and said, yeah, I'm into this, I'm prepared to take some risks, I'm prepared to have some hardship, I'm prepared to also have a lot of joy and feel more fulfilled than, I would be just, tagging along in some other enterprise. Then I think what you need to do is to decide whether the brand that you are creating is really a manifestation of yourself and your values, or whether it's a sort of an alter ego, whether it's something that you just wish that you could make for the world. Because it'll give you a bit of mental safety along the way to know which one of those it is. Because some founders create brands in their own image. and then are very upset when the public doesn't love it, and it becomes quite a fundamentally searching series of questions that they need to ask themselves about why they're not succeeding rather than their brand. So you also kind of need to make that early fork in the road decision, I think. Most people, of course, will found brands with a conviction that the things they believe in should be manifested by that brand. So mostly founders present brands in their own image in some way, but it's still a good question to ask yourself. And then I think having done those kind of safety checks on yourself and taking those forks in the road, it's really deciding what category you want to go into. Is it a category that you know a great deal about? Like I started a business in whiskey, and another one in music, and another one in food. I knew a bit about each of those, but I hadn't ever run a business in those areas before. So do you stick to what you've always known? Because the learning by osmosis that we do through our working lives is unbelievable. You know, you just know so much about categories that you worked in without even realizing it. And if you decide that, you know, you've got a bit of money or a bit of an opportunity and you're going to start a bicycle brand, but you've never done manufacturing and engineering, then, you know, be a bit cautious. I'm not saying hesitate, but be a bit cautious before taking the plunge. You know, if instead you've worked in the detergent market all of your life and you know that there's an opportunity to do, you know, a non-frothing, non-hand wrecking, but still whitening of clothes proposition, then good for you. You know exactly what you're going for. So you choose the category. And once you choose the category, I think you then get into a fairly well-defined series of things. One is, first of all, what are the category needs? What drives people here? Probably most of the people on this call won't be old enough to remember things called graphic equalizers, which we all used to have in our cars to make our terrible stereos sound a bit better. And there are lots of little dials that you put up and down to kind of increase the treble and the bass. And I kind of think of our 16 drivers as a bit of a graphic equalizer for looking at categories. Has this category got a lot of treble, or is it really bassy? You know, are all the brands playing bass, and is there therefore room for a really trebly brand in here? So you look at the category and you figure out what are people in this category expressing as their needs? How well are those being satisfied? Where do the brands currently play? Can you do a mapping on that basis? And then, do I want to play where perhaps the leader is? Do I want to play where the number 2 is? Do I want to play where the stragglers are because they've got a good idea, but they don't seem to have quite got the right cut of the story? Or do I actually want to say, no, I'm going to go over here and make a whole different proposition up in this category? So that's the first thing, you know, establish what category needs are and how you want to map yourself into it. And once you've done that, I think it's to work really singularly on what the proposition is that satisfies that. I mean, with ProQuo, what we've done is said there are bajillions of brand managers out there, all of whom are pretty stressed because it's not an easy job to put together what is a sometimes fairly nebulous thing. You know, it's a feeling, it's a proposition. It's not, you know, 1 + 1 = 2 in marketing. And when we looked at the marketplace, brand managers were relying upon things like insight and market research companies for some analysis, and then they had to extrapolate and conclude from it. They were talking to marketing consultancies who didn't really have any skin in the game and would come up with some ideas that they could or could not follow. They were talking to advertising agencies and the strategists and planners within them who were giving them lines of thought. But of course, often with a vested interest, so it had to be approached with a bit of caution. And so it went on. There are loads of people giving advice to brand managers. But what we thought we might be able to do is to produce this analysis machine so that brand managers could be completely confident that they're basing their decisions on proper stuff. And then really become the sort of Iron Man suit for them. So whatever strengths the brand manager has, we'll try to amplify them. And where they have some weaknesses, we'll try to supplement them. And that evidences itself in us producing advice that's based on that analysis and says, do you know what? There's so many things you could do, but these three things look like the right thing for you to do, given your goals, given your category, given the competitive marketplace, and so on. So I suppose coming back to it all and your question, if you're into founding a brand, think about why you're doing it, whether it needs to be you, be clear about the category you're going into, identify your proposition, and then with passion, pursue it relentlessly.
I love that answer. And I think the bit around, like I had that kind of slight like shame blush when you were talking about founders building brands in their own, like in their own model, and like whether it's an ego or it's just an extrapolation of themselves. I was just thinking like, oh God, I need to make the Copy Club not just about me. Sorry all. Duly noted. When we then think about brand managers, so this audience for whom you've built this platform, as you say, like I completely agree, they have a really tough job. And I think the way brand managers are being asked to like reinvent themselves year on year puts them under a huge amount of pressure. I know there's not going to be one answer to this because every brand will have different objectives, but what do you see in the brand managers you work with, or how do you think they need to be changing, developing in this current climate?
I mean, we talk about this kind of pandemic a lot and its influences, and I mean, of course, it has an effect, and we can come to that. But I think there's a more kind of permanent existential dilemma for all of us in brand management, which is that, you know, if you look at it organizationally, CEOs have a number of reports. They'll have the operations people, they'll have the finance people, they'll have the production people, supply chain people, legal people, and they all have incredibly clear KPIs. You know, they all have really identifiable objectives and key results, or whatever metric system is in use in that enterprise. And the one which always waltzes in with a bit of seeming fluff around them is the chief marketing officer or whoever's in charge of marketing. Like, what are you doing? Yeah, I'm just making people like us more. What are you doing? Oh, I'm just making sure that people are more aware of us. So then, like, you know, awareness scores become unbelievably important. I moved the dial from 22%, you know, unprompted, to 24%. Can I have my bonus? You know, and it's not necessarily the best thing for the brand just to be building awareness, but it becomes one of those easier to measure entrepreneurially things, and so brand managers are kind of held to account on some things which are not necessarily the best things to be focused on for the health and progress of their brand. And they're also always kind of subjected to a little bit of skepticism as to their contribution to the business. You know, haven't we all heard, oh, you're the, you know, numbers and colors, you know, you're the one with the paint box.
Coloring in department. Yeah.
So moralizing, the coloring in department. When in truth, what the brand really most often is the accessible expression of a business. You know, it is what the whole thing stands for. I mean, if you're talking to GSK and they've got 1,000 brands, then, you know, less so. But, you know, if you're talking to Pip and Nut, or, you know, even to something like TransferWise, or, you know, any of the kind of newish brands that have come into the world that we all know of, the brand is really the manifestation of the business, and there could almost be nothing more important. So, you know, your question was, how should brand managers change or kind of progress these days? And it's not an easy answer. I think marketing generally and brand management specifically need to acquire a better way of proving their worth to a business. This isn't meant to be an advertisement for ProQuo, but that is partly what our metrics are trying to do, also to say, you know, you moved the brand from here to here on a very well adjusted series of measures, which proves that, you know, you're getting some return on the investment that you're making, and that it has a remarkable impact, a measurable impact on your balance sheet. Because the kind of the ProQuo score that a brand gets can be correlated with the enterprise value of that business, and you can see its effect on it. So brand managers, I think, do not have an easy solution these days, but I think focusing on how the brand is the business and is the manifestation of that whole enterprise is a good place to start and to take the high ground. And then your sort of sub-question was about, I suppose, COVID and how things are affecting us here. I guess that, we're all aware of many things that we have to manage, but probably more than ever, understanding empathy within a brand is important. Do you really get what people need right now? And then connection, which is, and do people relate to the way in which you are conducting yourself? Because I think some brands which pre-COVID might have carried on in a particular fashion would look inappropriate now, and others which might have kind of assumed that they served a purpose need to look again and say, what is it exactly that people need at the moment? I mean, for example, we were looking at a load of ready meals, and one brand decided quite early in the pandemic to adjust their distribution strategy and to move it out of retailers and much more direct to consumer, and set up a whole new organization for it. So the same fundamental need existed for pre-packaged meals that were prepared for you. But because of the terrible sense of peril that so many people have felt in going out to shop for things, the possibility to reduce the need for that daily became an enormous new need. And this brand empathetically spotted that and adjusted its behavior to that, which completely distinguished it and raised its profile and its success immediately.
That's quite an obvious example of a customer insight, as in, actually, maybe this is me being reductive, but it feels as though we could say, if you're a ready meal brand and COVID happens, it makes sense for you to think about direct to consumer. Lizzie's asked a question in the chat around insight on the whole. And I think there are situations where insight isn't that straightforward. So if you have a shoestring budget, how do you suggest you do robust category research to work out if you have product market fit? And if you do, how can you find out who is your customer?
I guess the inevitable answer here is that you do need to understand what people feel, and it's not an easy task.
Yeah.
I say that partly because of the science. If you ask people stuff, they'll tell you what they think, but that doesn't necessarily measure what they feel. Thinking and feeling are different things. So my advice is, as often as possible, to try and find, if you can't afford, because of the budget that you're on, to kind of access a system and infrastructure that gives you information about your consumers, then it's kind of down to you. And what we mustn't be too seduced by, I think, is the written word. It's more the felt feeling and how it's expressed, and that's incredibly hard for us to access in the wider world. But I think, it does come from things like ethnography, observing as much as you possibly can. I think doing a series of interviews yourself, obviously these days they're mainly done digitally, but, a series of discoveries about people, and you just have to be really careful yourself to ensure that you're not going in with an agenda, that your mind is clear so that other people's thoughts can fill it. I think one of the real downfalls of doing our own interviewing about our own businesses is that we go in with a lot of preconceptions and possibly prejudices, and they obstruct other people's thoughts really getting to where they need to get to. So ethnography, the observation of things as often as you can, interviewing and discovery as often as you can. I think you can also observe things like social media feeds and just begin to see the sorts of things that are being talked about, even in subtle ways, just like the language that appears. I mean, I have 4 kids, the youngest of whom is 16. His language is quite different from his next sibling, who's 23. And I know it's coming from TikTok, so he says things like, that hits different. which
what
none
does
of my
that
other
even mean? I need that like transcribed.
Well, what the point I want to make is that if you were marketing to Gen Z, who are now, I saw the other day, 40% of the world's population, and over half of that Gen Z cohort can't legally be interviewed for their thoughts. So we're guessing at, a huge proportion of what the world is thinking at the moment. But if you observe and do things like, watching them on TikTok or seeing what's put in other social media feeds, you can pick up an enormous amount of kind of environmental change. And I use that phrase "hits different" just as an example of it, because nobody else in my household uses that. But we've all kind of come to know it, along with peak and a few other stupid bloody things that they're always saying to each other. But that means that if you're calibrating your brand to your audience, you can pick up a great deal without having to pay for it. You can sensitize yourself and therefore behave in a manner that they can connect to, that they can relate to.
So the answer is interviews. And yeah, I just think I think I can confirm how many times I've seen interviews done badly and how many times I've seen leading questions asked. So I just think, to echo that, if you're going to do research interviews, really make sure you're structuring them right and you're asking genuinely open-ended questions and you're really listening.
I think the answer is not only interviews, actually, Lottie. It's observation.
Yeah. Okay.
Really acute and sensitive observation is as important as the spoken words that you'll have given to you.
I love that build. And you would do that you would do that by watching. So that's watching the conversations people have, that's watching the way they interact, watching them shop. Yeah,
I mean, go and hang out in the supermarket and watch how they shop the aisle, where their eyes go, where they move, how often they put things back, whether they don't hesitate in your category, but they deliberate for ages in another one. Learn all of that stuff for sure. You can also ask people if you can come and just watch them in their homes for an hour. It's a bit weird and you can't do that very easily at the moment, but that's really good ethnography. I mean, you'll understand whether, the keeper of the house really gives a shit about lime scale in her oven or his oven, or the kettle, but by seeing how much attention they truly pay to it. Whereas if you said to them, do you care about lime scale in your kettle? They'll all say, yes, I don't want to poison my family. But, normally they don't do a thing about it. So observation is really important, but I'm also saying observation of channels, observations of communication, because if you can pick up how people communicate and the key thoughts that they're having in those communication. Another one on TikTok at the moment is body count. Like, it used to be, how many people have you slept with? Now it's, what's your body count, which has come from a military environment. What's your body count? How many people have you shot? So that there's a weird heartening of the kind of sexual experience conversation that's going on, and being sensitive to those sorts of things can really make your brand feel much more connected to its audience. Sorry if I've upset anybody.
I think no one is upset. I think a lot of us are like quietly downloading TikTok in panic. Okay, what brands do this well? Let's talk about some inspiration. Who do you see out there who you think is maybe ProQuo subscribers, brands that are using observation, are using this power of seduction really well to grow?
Crikey, that is a difficult one. And I should have prepared good examples earlier on. I should have anticipated that question. There's a brand that I've noticed doing quite a lot of good work on Instagram called Finisterre. Probably most people will know it. It's not that obscure a brand. It's a clothing brand that is kind of quite assertively eco-friendly, but doesn't do it in a way that makes you feel like you're being a goody two-shoes by embracing it, which has always been the problem with kind of environmental sensitivity, though thankfully less and less so.
Yeah.
And so Finisterre just seems to express itself in ways which are down to earth, of the moment, rather than coming from that different world as it used to be of environmental sensitivity. The other one that I think I really like, which isn't kind of a new brand in any way, and it's actually a huge brand, is Patagonia. I mean, they are so assertive, like, fuck you, do not do this. We're not going to do it. It's so powerful and brave. And it feels, I don't know why, but it feels much more authentic than Nike doing it, because Nike have obviously also done, quite a lot of Black Lives Matter and other kind of things, burning, not burning shoes, but having their shoes burned by Trump supporters in horror at their support of Colin Kaepernick. But there are so many brands doing it, I think, in subtle and everyday ways. And I think it's the small things, not the big campaigns, that really do it. It's a kind of an example I very often use, which isn't so much about communication, but is about usership or usage experience. Is, probably we've all tried smoked salmon at some stage, and what your experience will probably have been that when you open that funny little plastic pack and try to get your fish off the little board underneath, you inevitably get covered in fish oil, and then you have to go and wash your hands, and it's all grubby and a bit sort of messy. And if you don't eat all of the stuff on the board, what do you do with it? Do you try and put it back on the board and then shove it in that little plastic pack and try and roll it up so it doesn't just dry out in the fridge? I mean, that's ethnography. That's watching what brands or what people do with their brands. So, and I'm afraid I can't remember the brand that did it, but a brand invented a sort of zip-lockable, much more easily accessible bit of fish that you could take the portion you wanted from and put it back without grubbing yourself up. And without degrading the product by storing it. That is the sort of thing that people need to be doing, really identifying usage and content with the experience.
Yeah, and getting rid of that annoying little plastic sheets that sit behind the bits of smoked salmon. Lily is agreeing with the smoked salmon struggle. Good middle class audience. Okay, question from Oliver. Throughout all of your previous businesses, which aspects do you try and keep consistent between them? It's a very interesting question.
Yeah, great. There is a line that I can follow now with my ability to have a great retrospective view on things. When I was in market research, I really understood the importance of getting people. It sounds so obvious to say, but really understanding people, not just kind of measuring them, but really understanding them fundamentally. The thing that I didn't like about it was, as a business, that in market research, you have to have almost a new good idea every day. There's you have to redo the whole thing every day. And so in terms of an enterprise, your revenue ceiling is capped by the number of people you can employ, multiplied by the numbers that they'll work, and the maximum fee you can charge per hour. I mean, it's an awful business model, but anyway, lots of people have it. When I started a whiskey business, what I realized, to my great delight, was that you can have one good idea and sell it endlessly. It was just such a relief. I mean, it was fantastic. And then my excitement was about dressing it up in different ways, or what sponsorship would we do, or what new packaging names would we come up with. But fundamentally, you had a bottle of whiskey that you're selling, and so that's been brought through into this brand management business, where essentially it's been quite a complex creation, but we've created a product which is a brand management platform driven by AI that people subscribe to at incredibly low cost. And therefore not very much pain for them, and hopefully quite a lot of gain. And so the idea of the whiskey has come through into the brand management business, like make a product and sell it relentlessly, which is where I've kind of got to now. But all the time, the thing that's kind of remained most true, I guess, is just really connecting with who your users are. Who are the people that you're talking to? What's the quid pro quo in your relationship? How can you introduce a positive exchange where they feel they get more out of the brand and your business than they give to you? Because they give you their money, they give you their advocacy if you're lucky, they give you their loyalty if you're lucky. That's quite a lot. So your brand and service of your product and service have got to give a lot in return.
Yeah. I love that idea of have one good idea and keep selling it.
Yeah.
Talk us through the journey. So you've gone from, Oliver's follow-up question is, how do you decide when it's the right time to move on to a new project? And I think where that's coming from is like, it's clearly been quite a journey. How did you move from whiskey to ProQuo, and how do you keep it all going?
I think our journeys in life are really accidental. It so much depends on who you meet along the way and what opportunity presents itself. I had absolutely no idea that I would end up in first market research and then whiskey, and I was in horse breeding for a while. I mean, it's, madness. But the question, Oliver's question, I think, is about when do you know when it's right to move on?
Yeah.
And I think there's some quite hard-nosed answers to that, which is, why are you in it anyway? Are you in it here to aggrandize your ego, in which case you'll probably never leave it if it's working, because you're happy. It does what it makes you feel good about what you're doing, so stay there. It might be that you've set a financial metric. When I am able to value this business at and hopefully sell it at, I'm out of here. And then there are others, I suppose, along the way, which might be hierarchical, that I would like to go from this position in a business to another one, and I kind of deliberately do this kind of upward movement because that's the way so many of us think about growth. Or it may be to do with particular metrics for the business itself. I want to have 2% market share. I want to have 5% market share. I want 20% of people in this category to know about me. All of these different things. But I think one's personal position is very much driven by one's fundamental motivations. So why are you in the job anyway? And when do you think it'll be less fulfilling? I do think that the same quid pro quo thing applies. Once you find that you're getting less out of your work than you're putting into it, you should leave. I think it's kind of true with everything.
And has that been the feeling that was the tipping point for you?
Probably not, actually. I think I'm just ill-disciplined and restless. Well, with the market research business, Sadek Weinberg, I started, in a room with a laptop, and it became the biggest company of its size in the world, and I sold it to WPP. I was bored by the end of it. It was just so repetitive that all there was left to do was to keep scaling it. It had already become so big. So I sold it. And from there I went into, I said to myself, I must practice what I preach. Stop telling everybody what to do with their brands and make one your bloody self, I told myself. So I had bizarrely bought an island off the west coast of Ireland with some of my ill-gotten gains. And I thought, well, authenticity is really important in brands. And so here's a place, why don't I just make stuff on it? That's the beginning of an authentic voyage. And what surrounded the island were fish. So I started selling fish. We did smoked salmon and a few other things. And then I thought, but also the water that comes in off the Atlantic, that, it's, instead of talking about all those Scottish brands and Scotch brands, with their little burns and their little flowing waters, we'll just capture this clean water that comes over the Atlantic and lands on the west coast of Ireland. And so I kind of felt like I had a just differentiated story around whiskey, and that was very much where I wanted to live, and I had a beautiful time on that island, a wonderful part of the world. And so I was very invigorated by the whole thing. And actually, I kind of found a lesson which is around proposition in that, which I'll just dwell on for a second, which was that the island, everybody thought the island was a great retreat. They'd all say, oh, you're retreating there, and oh, you'd be so rejuvenated there. And all the words came in, rehabilitating, and all these sorts of things, retreat. And actually, it was called Inishturk Beg, and I played with the words, I often play with words, and the in part of it fascinated me. And I thought actually it was much more about inspiration and invigoration and all the in things, which made it so much more positive a story. So I took great positivity from the whole experience. And after doing that successfully for a while, I did feel that with the richness of experience that I had in market research, and the new richness of experience I had in actually founding a brand and running it reasonably successfully, that I probably had something new to offer, which was the collision of those two things, so that you didn't just have an analysis machine as of old or an action machine, but one that was, spliced together, and which employed a new thing which I'd never played with before, which was AI. So that's kind of what kept me going.
I'm going to take that as a perfect segue into our penultimate question, which is, where do you get inspiration from? Not rejuvenation, but inspiration.
Oh gosh, I don't know really. I think
you read.
I do read. I don't read anywhere near as much as I used to, and I'm obviously reading far too much of TikTok at the moment. I think part of my lucky place in life is that I'm half Irish, half Egyptian. When I was 2 months old, my parents took me to Ghana, and then I grew up in Nigeria and Kenya, and then I moved to Malaysia and Indonesia, and white faces, black faces, other faces, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, different languages. I've always been surrounded by just a lot of different things. And so I've kind of fundamentally always known that there's no single path through life, and that there's no right way. And that it's actually pretty exciting and invigorating to have many spices in your life, variety being the spice of life. And so I've always been open to opportunity. Sometimes I've wasted my time, but I don't think I've ever kind of wasted my life on it. I've certainly wasted some money as well. But I just love the notion of doing stuff. At the moment, I think you mentioned in the introduction, I manage a musical artist. That's an incredibly hard job. I mean, brand management of musical talents is so difficult. What a miserable industry that is, full of people, harassing you and knocking your ego and making it impossible for you to feel good about yourself. I mean, she was told by a former manager that she should lose 3 stone and have a heroin chic look. And I thought, Christ, what a thing to say to a young woman. So, that's a path I never expected to be going down, but I'm sort of in the middle of it.
How did it happen, and what have you learned from it? We should take 2 minutes to dwell on that fascinating detail.
I was one of the things that I did on the island was I started a thing called the Sessions. I wanted to have bands on the island. I thought it'd be good fun to just be surrounded by music, and I love Irish traditional music and others. So I got a band onto the island, and they were called the Inishtoik Sessions, and we recorded for 2 weeks straight. And the album went to #1, and we wrote a book about it, and that went to #1 as well. So I thought, oh, maybe I understand a bit about this. But I really didn't. It was just like, here's a product, here's a band, and here's a way to sell it. And I kind of got into music at the time that CDs and books were both dying as industry, but it succeeded briefly. And that gave me the courage to get into music, I suppose, as a quick answer.
Are there things you've learned from brand management in music that you would apply to brand management in more mainstream brands?
I think partnerships is the biggest thing I've learned from it. Musicians make almost no money from their music any longer, and it's all to do with brand partnerships. And I think the notion of matchmaking brands is really fascinating for me. So, if you're Ariana Grande and you're offered $1 million to open the Chinese Super League football, do an association with Million fragrances, or promote Mercedes, which one of those reduces or improves your brand equity? You might get the same $1 million from each of them, but some of them are going to be additive to your brand equity, and some of them are going to be subtractive. And you have to be really careful about managing that. Don't just always follow the money. Think about what the commingled DNA of that offer is. That I've really learned that from music.
That's such an important lesson, and I think one that we don't take seriously enough. Partnerships are always in every marketing strategy, but kind of dealt with as an afterthought, as opposed to put front and center. Okay, one more question that we ask everyone. The Copy Club is a forum where there is no such thing as a silly question, and everyone needs support. So what's one thing that you need help with that this gang might be able to offer?
Oh, crikey. That's really easy. Come and talk to us, and it's not just about the business. It's we are absolutely on a mission to help and encourage all sorts of early stage brands. We need it to develop our AI, so there's a benefit for us even if we don't work with you for charge. Just come and seek us out. Let's have a chat.
And I can confirm they're a really lovely bunch, so I'd recommend that anyone who wants some advice on brand building reaches out to the ProQuo team. Nadim, thank you so much for your time. That was absolutely fascinating. Like, big takeaways from me around you can't push something that no one wants, the focus on proposition, thinking about mapping out the category, and observation, I think, is a really key thing I'm going to go away and do more on. Gang, thank you so much for joining. We will be back same time tomorrow and Friday for installments 4 and 5. And we will Fran will send round the recording for anyone who wants to catch bits they missed, and also send around an intro to the ProQuo team if anyone wants to help Nadim out with a chat. Cool.
Great.
Happy Wednesday.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Anytime. Take care all.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.